In August 1942, off the dark waters of Guadalcanal, Japanese naval officers stood on the bridges of their warships, supremely confident in their mastery of the Pacific night. They had reason to be arrogant. For decades, the Imperial Japanese Navy had perfected the art of nocturnal combat to a degree unmatched by any fleet in history. Their lookouts, rigorously trained to avoid sunlight and equipped with massive binoculars manufactured by Nippon Kagaku and Tokyo Optical, could spot enemy vessels at distances that seemed almost supernatural. Their officers snickered at the clumsy Americans fumbling with their electronic boxes and radar sets. Why would anyone need invisible radio waves when Japanese eyes could pierce the darkness with such devastating clarity? The smug dismissal was about to become one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in naval warfare. What these officers didn't know, as they gazed through their superior optical equipment that August night, was that those primitive American radar sets they so thoroughly mocked would soon track every single ship in their fleet through total darkness, setting the stage for a technological revolution that would render their vaunted night vision tactics completely obsolete. The confidence of Japanese naval officers in 1941 and 1942 was not unfounded arrogance, but rather the product of systematic investment and rigorous training. During the 1920s and 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Navy had confronted a fundamental strategic problem. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 had imposed a 5-5-3 ratio of capital ships between the United States, Britain, and Japan, leaving the Japanese fleet at a severe numerical disadvantage should war come with America. Japanese naval strategists knew they could not match the industrial output of the United States in a protracted conflict. They needed force multipliers, asymmetric advantages that would allow their inferior numbers to whittle down the American battle line before the decisive engagement that everyone expected would occur somewhere in the Western Pacific. The solution they chose was to become the undisputed masters of night combat, an arena where numbers mattered less than training, tactics, and technology. The Japanese investment in optical superiority was staggering. Companies like Nippon Kakojo Kabushiki Gaisha, which would later become Nikon, developed enormous binoculars with objective lenses measuring 12 centimeters, 18 centimeters, and even 21 centimeters in diameter. These massive brass and steel instruments, mounted on towers 90 feet high on Japanese warships, could gather up to 980 times more light than the human eye. The largest models could spot ships at distances approaching 20 miles. Between 1939 and 1944, Japan imported roughly 200,000 pounds of the finest optical glass from Germany's shot glass works to support this manufacturing effort. The binoculars weren't simply large, they were precision instruments. The 5-centimeter Nova-type binoculars came equipped with detachable night vision, enhancing filters specifically designed to better refract and capture available starlight and moonlight. Combined with the Navy's practice of assigning lookouts who rigorously avoided sunlight to preserve their night vision, these optical systems gave Japanese warships an almost uncanny ability to detect enemy vessels in conditions where American and British ships were effectively blind. This optical advantage was paired with relentless training and tactical innovation. Japanese cruiser and destroyer crews practiced night maneuvers constantly, developing the muscle memory and coordination needed to execute complex tactical formations in total darkness. Officers studied the play of light on water, learned to read the faint wakes of distant ships, and perfected the use of star shells and float planes to illuminate enemy formations at critical moments. The entire tactical doctrine of the Imperial Japanese Navy was built around achieving surprise, closing to what they considered decisive range, and unleashing devastating torpedo salvos before the enemy even realized they were under attack. By 1941, Japanese naval officers genuinely believed they had achieved something approaching perfection in the dark maritime battlefield. American wargaming at Newport during the 1930s had led U.S. planners to underestimate the value of night combat readiness, a miscalculation the Japanese were eager to exploit. Into this culture of optical supremacy came the first whispers of radar, a technology that Japanese engineers had actually pioneered in some respects. The Japanese claimed to have built their first cavity magnetron as early as 1937, and by 1939 the Japan Radio Company had produced a 10-centimeter, 500-watt cavity magnetron. The British did not produce a comparable design until February 1940. For a brief moment, Japan led the world in this crucial technology, but leadership in basic research did not translate into operational enthusiasm or institutional support. The first inklings of radar's military potential did not penetrate Japanese naval thinking until late 1939, which was remarkably late, considering how quickly other major powers were moving. When a German professor named Barkhausen informed Japanese scientists in 1938 that the German Navy already had operational radar and that Japan had better accelerate its efforts, the response was tepid. The technology seemed unnecessary, even suspect. Why invest in improving electronic systems when Japanese optical technology was demonstrably superior? The institutional resistance ran deep. Yanagimoto Ryosaka, chief of the armament section of the Navy General Staff, insisted that the Navy could not go to war without radar, and the Navy Ministry instituted a crash program of radar development on August 2, 1941. But the effort was half-hearted at best. The Navy's Electrical Research Department, which bore responsibility for radar development, had grown to just 300 staff by August 1943, a pitifully small number for such a critical technology in the middle of a global war. Technical officers, the men who might have championed electronic warfare systems, were looked down upon by line officers who dominated Japanese naval culture. Recruiting technical personnel proved difficult. There was even one 6-year period when not a single graduate of the engineering department of Tokyo Imperial University volunteered for Navy duty. By November 1942, faced with critical officer shortages, technical officers were simply absorbed into the regular officer corps to fill gaps, further diluting expertise in emerging technologies. The cultural mindset of Japanese manufacturers reinforced this technological conservatism. One German professor observed that Japanese universities resembled senior high schools and vocational schools because what was to be studied was established in advance, leaving little room for academic freedom or innovation. Japanese manufacturers, he noted, were remarkably uniform in their methodology and use of materials, reflecting a rigid mindset that hindered the kind of creative problem-solving radar development required. Meanwhile, Japanese faith in their optical systems bordered on religious conviction. Officers genuinely believed that well-trained human eyes equipped with superior binoculars could outperform any electronic system, particularly given radar's crude early displays and vulnerability to interpretation errors. The fact that the United States and Britain were rushing to develop radar was seen not as a warning, but as confirmation that Western navies lacked the discipline and training to fight properly at night. By the time Japan entered the war in December 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy had fielded several radar systems, but they were primitive and deployed in limited numbers. The Mark I Model 1, a 3-meter wavelength fixed-site early warning radar operating at 100 MHz, had been rushed into production in fall 1941. Only 30 units were delivered before Pearl Harbor. The Mark II Model 1, a long-wave shipboard radar, proved so unsatisfactory that it was quickly superseded by the Mark II Model 2 in 1942. This improved model had a peak power of just 2 kilowatts, a range of about 35 kilometers against large naval targets, and separate cone-shaped transmit and receive antennas that gave it the odd appearance of giant toy binoculars. About 400 were eventually built and deployed across the fleet. The Japanese also developed what would become their most advanced wartime radar, the Mark II Model 2 operating at 10 centimeters, using their early magnetron technology. But crucially, no operational Japanese radar set ever had a planned position indicator display, the circular screen that showed targets as blips relative to the ship's position. Japanese radar operators had to interpret range and bearing from crude oscilloscope displays, greatly limiting the system's tactical utility for naval operations. What truly crippled Japanese radar effectiveness, however, were the operational procedures born of cultural attitudes and tactical doctrine. Japanese prisoners of war later reported that Japanese early warning radars were routinely shut down when Allied aircraft came within 10 miles, lest the radar emissions provide a homing point for enemy attackers. This practice, rooted in a misunderstanding of how radar detection worked and an excess of caution about radio silence, completely eliminated radar's primary purpose of providing early warning and enabling vectored interceptions. The Japanese Navy likewise ordered ships to keep their radars shut down when under radio silence until 1944, which again eliminated any value for early warning or tactical coordination. These self-imposed restrictions meant that even when Japanese ships were equipped with radar, they often entered combat essentially blind by electronic standards, forced to rely on their vaunted optical systems, while American ships operated with full radar coverage. Meanwhile, the sinking of the radar-equipped auxiliary Yamakibo Maru at Truk in November 1943 proved disastrous, as much valuable radar equipment and trained personnel were lost in a single stroke. The Japanese attitude toward radar reached its most extreme expression in their relationship with Germany, their supposed ally. Germany was so lacking in confidence in Japanese victory in the Pacific that German authorities were reluctant to share radar technology with Japan, fearing it would fall into Allied hands through capture. The one exception to this rule was the Würzburg radar, for which Germany sent complete specifications to Japan, but this may have been because the British had already captured Würzburg during the Berneval Commando raid in 1942, rendering its secrets compromised anyway. Japanese technical missions to Germany in 1943 found that the Germans had little interest in Japanese technology. Japanese scientists failed to mention their cavity magnetron achievements, apparently assuming the Germans were so far ahead that Japan had nothing to offer. This mutual lack of communication and technology sharing, rooted in both practical security concerns and cultural arrogance on both sides, proved a significant benefit to the Allied cause. Meanwhile, the Americans and British were racing ahead with radar development and, more importantly, with integrating radar into every aspect of naval operations. By mid-1941, American cruisers were being equipped with SC air search radar and the revolutionary SG surface search radar. The SG radar, operating at 10 centimeters with about 50 kilowatts of power, provided clear plan position indicator displays that operators could read at a glance. More critically, American naval culture was rapidly embracing radar as a primary sensor, not a supplement to optical observation. Radar operators were trained extensively, and tactical doctrines were rewritten to exploit radar's all-weather, day and night capabilities. The Americans recognized what the Japanese could not, that radar didn't need to be perfect to be revolutionary. It simply needed to work well enough, reliably enough, to provide earlier warning and more accurate fire control than human eyes and rangefinders alone could manage. The collision between these two tactical philosophies came with devastating clarity in the waters around Guadalcanal in August 1942. On the night of August 8 to 9th, Vice Admiral Genichi Mikawa led a Japanese task force of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer down the slot toward Guadalcanal, intent on destroying the American transport fleet that had just landed Marines on the island. The Allied screening force consisted of 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 6 destroyers arranged in 2 groups, patrolling the waters off Savo Island. 2 radar-equipped destroyers, USS Blue and USS Ralph Talbot, were stationed as picket ships west of Savo Island specifically to provide early warning of Japanese approach. The stage was set for the first major test of radar versus optical systems in a night surface engagement. What happened next stunned the naval world. Mikawa's force, equipped with no radar whatsoever, but with lookouts trained to perfection and armed with massive binoculars, slipped through the darkness with their ships at battle stations and their optical instruments sweeping the horizon. At approximately 12:43 a.m. on August 9th, the Japanese passed unnoticed, just 500 yards behind the destroyer Ralph Talbot. The American radar had detected something, but the operators were focused on navigation landmarks to the east and didn't notice the lethal fleet bearing down from the opposite direction. Minutes earlier, the destroyer Blue had cut directly in front of the Japanese formation, her radar showing nothing. The enemy was lost in what radar operators called the shadow, the dead zone created by nearby Savo Island interfering with radar returns. Meanwhile, Japanese lookouts had spotted the silhouettes of Allied ships almost perfectly positioned for slaughter. At 1:38 a.m., Japanese cruisers launched the first salvo of Type 93 long-lance torpedoes, the oxygen-fueled weapons that could reach ranges of 20 to 40,000 yards, more than double what American torpedoes could achieve. The Battle of Savo Island became one of the worst defeats in United States Navy history. Within minutes, Japanese shells and torpedoes had crippled the cruiser HMAS Canberra. The cruiser USS Chicago took a torpedo hit that blew off a section of her bow. The Japanese force then swept north around Savo Island and caught the northern group of American cruisers completely by surprise. The cruisers USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, and USS Quincy were systematically destroyed by accurate gunfire and torpedo hits. By the time the sun rose on August 9th, 4 Allied cruisers had been sunk or scuttled, and more than 1,000 sailors were dead. The Japanese force withdrew, having suffered only light damage. From a Japanese perspective, the battle was a vindication of everything they believed about night combat. Their optical systems had worked flawlessly. Their lookouts had detected the enemy first. Their torpedoes had struck from ranges the Americans didn't believe possible. Their gunnery, aided by searchlight illumination and float plane drop flares, had been devastatingly accurate. The Americans had radar, but it hadn't saved them. The Japanese drew precisely the wrong lesson from Savo Island. The victory confirmed their belief that optical systems and night training were superior to electronic gadgetry. American officers, meanwhile, began a painful process of learning. The loss of 4 cruisers in a single night action demanded a thorough investigation. The Hepburn investigation, led by Admiral Arthur J. Hepburn, identified multiple failures: poor state of readiness for night attack, failure to react to repeated sightings of Japanese forces, overdependence on inadequate radar, inefficient communications, and insufficient aerial reconnaissance. But critically, the investigation did not conclude that radar was useless. Instead, it identified that American radar doctrine, training, and tactics needed urgent improvement. The Americans had the technology, but they didn't yet know how to use it properly. The next major night engagement came just 2 months later, in October 1942, at the Battle of Cape Esperance. This time, Rear Admiral Norman Scott's Task Force 64 was specifically prepared for night action. Scott had been drilling his force in night operations and had carefully studied the lessons of Savo Island. His formation included the cruisers USS San Francisco, USS Boise, USS Salt Lake City, and USS Helena, along with 5 destroyers. Crucially, the light cruisers Helena and Boise were equipped with the newer SG surface search radar, while San Francisco carried only the older SC air search radar. Scott himself was still not entirely convinced of radar's utility, preferring tried and tested optical systems and searchlights. But the institutional learning process had begun. At 11:25 p.m. on October 11th, Helena's SG radar detected Japanese ships at a range of 27,700 yards, more than 15 miles. The contact report didn't reach Admiral Scott immediately because of communication confusion, but the Americans now had electronic eyes tracking Japanese ships that remained completely unaware they had been detected. What followed was tactically messy, with American ships initially holding fire because Scott feared they might be engaging their own destroyers, but the strategic message was unmistakable. The Americans had detected the Japanese first, positioned themselves advantageously, and opened fire while the Japanese were still trying to identify targets visually. Rear Admiral Aratamo Goto, commanding the Japanese force, was so confident in Japanese night fighting superiority that when his lookouts spotted American ships, he initially assumed they were friendly Japanese vessels from another task group. The notion that Americans would be operating aggressively off Savo Island at night seemed implausible. By the time Goto realized his error, his flagship Aoba was under heavy fire. Goto himself was mortally wounded. The Japanese lost the heavy cruiser Furitaka and the destroyer Fubuki, with 2 more destroyers sunk by American air attacks the following day. The Battle of Cape Esperance was the U.S. Navy's first surface victory against Japan, and radar had played a crucial role. The irony was profound, but most Japanese officers still didn't grasp its significance. The Americans had won not through superior training or better optical equipment, but through electronic detection that allowed them to strike first. Japanese after-action reports focused on tactical errors and bad luck rather than systemic technological inferiority. Some Japanese officers noted with satisfaction that their own optical systems had functioned well once combat was joined. What they failed to appreciate was that the Americans were rapidly closing the experience gap, while simultaneously exploiting a technological advantage that Japanese doctrine simply couldn't counter. Each engagement provided American radar operators with more experience, American tacticians with more data, and American officers with growing confidence in radar-directed night combat. Meanwhile, Japanese capabilities remained essentially static, trapped by institutional resistance to change and cultural faith in traditional methods. The full weight of American radar superiority came crashing down just 1 month after Cape Esperance, during the naval battle of Guadalcanal in mid-November 1942. On the night of November 12th to 13th, American and Japanese forces clashed in a confused, violent melee at point-blank range. The Americans used their radar to detect Japanese ships and establish firing solutions even in conditions of zero visibility created by rain squalls and gun smoke. The battle was chaotic, with ships firing at ranges measured in hundreds of yards rather than miles, but American radar provided crucial advantages in target identification and fire control. The Japanese lost the battleships Hai and Kirishima, destroyed by a combination of radar-directed gunfire and torpedo attacks. The Americans took heavy losses as well, but the strategic balance had shifted. Japanese night fighting supremacy, the foundation of their entire naval doctrine in the Solomons campaign, was crumbling under the weight of American technological and tactical adaptation, was transforming night combat from a contest of visual acuity and practiced coordination into an electronic battlespace, where early detection and accurate fire control trumped traditional skills. The Battle of Tassafaronga on November 30th, 1942, showed that Japanese torpedo tactics could still devastate American forces, as the heavy cruiser USS Northampton and 3 other cruisers were hit by long lance torpedoes. But even this tactical victory revealed strategic defeat. The Japanese had to execute nearly perfect torpedo attacks to overcome American advantages in numbers, radar detection, and fire control. A single mistake, a moment of confusion, and American radar would pinpoint Japanese ships and bring overwhelming firepower to bear. The margin for Japanese error was shrinking to nothing. Through 1943, American radar technology continued its rapid evolution while Japanese systems stagnated. The Americans developed fighter direction radar for carrier operations, sophisticated fire control radar for gunnery, and improved surface search sets with longer ranges and better resolution. More importantly, American tactical doctrine evolved to fully exploit these systems. Captain Arleigh Burke, commanding Destroyer Squadron 23, pioneered tactics that used radar to control high-speed night attacks, positioning his destroyers to launch torpedo salvos from beyond visual range before Japanese lookouts could spot his ships. Burke's aggressive use of radar-directed tactics turned American destroyers, previously vulnerable to Japanese night attacks, into lethal hunters that dominated the Solomon Islands night battles of mid-1943. The Japanese had no effective counter. Their optical systems, no matter how sophisticated, couldn't detect ships that struck from beyond visual range using electronic guidance. The technological gap widened further with the introduction of American proximity fuse shells in 1943. These weapons used miniature radar sets in the shell itself to detonate when near aircraft or surface targets, dramatically increasing anti-aircraft effectiveness and making even near misses potentially deadly. Japanese ships, lacking comparable technology, found themselves increasingly vulnerable to American air attacks, while their own anti-aircraft fire remained relatively ineffective. The same radar technology that was revolutionizing surface combat was simultaneously transforming air defense and making it nearly impossible for Japanese aircraft to approach American task forces without suffering devastating losses. Every domain of naval warfare was being reshaped by radar, and Japan was falling further behind in all of them. By 1944, the situation had become desperate for the Japanese. American submarines operating in Japanese waters were equipped with sophisticated radar that allowed them to track Japanese shipping and position for attacks with devastating precision. American carrier task forces used radar to detect incoming Japanese air attacks from hundreds of miles away, scrambling fighters to intercept long before the attackers could threaten the fleet. American battleships and cruisers used radar-directed fire control to achieve hit rates that would have been impossible with optical rangefinders alone. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, often called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, saw American radar-directed fighter direction and anti-aircraft fire destroy more than 600 Japanese aircraft in 2 days. Japanese losses were so catastrophic that carrier aviation as an effective Japanese offensive weapon essentially ceased to exist. Meanwhile, Japanese radar development continued to lag far behind Allied progress. The Type 22 radar, Japan's most widely deployed centimetric set, had been installed on several major warships by 1942, but production remained limited and the system's capabilities were modest compared to American equivalents. About 300 Type 22 sets were built during the entire war. Japanese airborne radar efforts produced the H-6 radar for installation on Betty bombers, with about 2,000 sets built, but these appeared in service only in 1944 and offer capabilities roughly equivalent to what the Allies had deployed 2 years earlier. The institutional resistance to radar had cost Japan not just technological advantage, but time, the one resource that couldn't be recovered. By the time Japanese officers finally recognized radar's transformational importance, American production and deployment had created a gap too large to close. The final vindication of radar over optics came at the Battle of Surigao Strait on October 25, 1944. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf positioned his force of 6 battleships and 8 cruisers across the northern exit of Surigao Strait, informed by radar-equipped PT boats and destroyers tracking the approaching Japanese force through the confined waters. When Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's ships entered the strait, they were detected by American radar long before Japanese lookouts could spot anything. American destroyers executed radar-directed torpedo attacks that crippled Japanese ships before the main engagement even began. Then, in a maneuver straight out of the Age of Sail, Oldendorf's battleships crossed the T, positioning perpendicular to the Japanese line of advance, where all American guns could fire while only Japanese forward turrets could bear. The entire engagement was directed by radar fire control. American battleships opened fire at ranges exceeding 20,000 yards in total darkness, achieving hits on Japanese ships that their lookouts couldn't even see. It was the last battleship engagement in history, and it was decided entirely by radar-directed gunnery. The Japanese force was annihilated. The technological lessons of the Pacific War were clear, even if they remained difficult for some to accept. Radar had not replaced human skill, but it had fundamentally altered what skills mattered. The thousands of hours Japanese lookouts spent training their night vision, the millions of yen invested in superior optical equipment, the decades of tactical development focused on visual detection all became largely irrelevant in the face of electronic sensors that could detect ships and aircraft regardless of darkness, weather, or visibility. More broadly, the radar revolution demonstrated a principle that would define military affairs for the rest of the 20th century. Technological advantage, properly exploited through doctrine and training, could overcome numerical inferiority, geographic disadvantage, and even superior tactical skill in traditional domains. Japan's failure with radar also revealed deeper institutional problems that plagued the Japanese war effort. The rigid separation between Army and Navy, which resulted in duplicative radar development programs that competed for scarce resources rather than collaborating, exemplified the organizational dysfunction that handicapped Japanese innovation. The cultural bias against technical officers, which left radar development starved of expertise and institutional support, showed how social attitudes could undermine technological progress. The reluctance to share information with Germany, born of assumptions about relative technological sophistication that were often wrong, demonstrated how arrogance and miscommunication between allies could deny both sides potential advantages. These weren't just technological failures, but systemic ones, rooted in how Japanese military institutions were organized, how they valued different forms of expertise, and how they made decisions about resource allocation. The post-war analysis by U.S. Naval Technical Mission to Japan documented the extent of the gap. Japanese radar had progressed during the war, with over 7,000 sets of 30 different types built, but these systems remained generations behind Allied equipment in capability, reliability, and integration into operational doctrine. The Tama Army Technology Research Institute wasn't formed until June 1943, far too late to influence the crucial early war period. Training units for radar operators were established only in 1944, when the war was already effectively lost. The entire Japanese radar effort was characterized by too little, too late, handicapped by initial skepticism, institutional resistance, and the mounting pressure of combat operations that left less and less room for innovation and experimentation. The human cost of these technological and institutional failures was staggering. Japanese ships that might have detected American forces earlier with better radar went to the bottom, taking thousands of sailors with them. Japanese aircraft that might have evaded radar-directed fighter interception were shot down by the hundreds. Japanese convoys that might have avoided submarine attacks through better electronic detection were torpedoed and sunk. The technological gap translated directly into casualties, lost ships, and ultimately into strategic defeat. By 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy that had once ruled the Pacific night with supreme confidence was reduced to scattered remnants hiding in harbors, unable to operate effectively against American forces that now dominated every domain of naval warfare through a combination of overwhelming numbers, industrial production, and systematic technological superiority. The optical equipment that Japanese officers had once pointed to with such pride, the massive binoculars that could supposedly see farther and clearer than any American system, ended up as museum pieces and war trophies. The U.S. Navy, with characteristic practicality, carefully studied captured Japanese binoculars and incorporated their best features into American designs. The irony was complete. Japanese optical technology was indeed superior, and the Americans acknowledged it by copying Japanese innovations. But by the time American manufacturers were producing binoculars based on Japanese designs, radar had already made optical detection a secondary concern. The technology the Japanese had perfected had been rendered largely obsolete by the technology they had dismissed. The story of Japanese naval officers mocking radar is a story about how confidence born of past success can blind institutions to revolutionary change. It's about how cultural attitudes and institutional biases can prevent the adoption of transformative technologies even when the technical knowledge exists. It's about how tactical excellence in one domain can become strategic liability when the rules of the game change. The Japanese Navy was arguably the best night fighting force in the world in 1941, but by 1944 night combat had been fundamentally transformed into something their doctrine and training had not prepared them for. The skills that had taken decades to develop were devalued in just a few years by electronic systems that could see through darkness better than the most trained human eye. What do you think of the Japanese dismissal of radar technology? Was it an understandable mistake based on their very real advantages in optical systems and night training? Or was it a catastrophic failure of imagination that revealed deep institutional problems in Japanese military culture? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.